Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
I don't know about you, but having listened to Badlands for as long as I have, listening to that Badlands intro, it's a little bit hard to collect your thoughts when you're about to start recording. And then also the rousing John Philip Sousa, Stars and Stripes Forever. I grew up listening to that stuff. My granddad made sure that we had a steady dose of that sort of thing. Gets the blood flowing. So welcome back to the No Treason Podcast. I hope you are ready to go. This is episode 2. I'm Jonathan Drake. Thank you for joining me to continue with the theme of energetic and rousing, energy-producing content. Please join me for a word from one of the sponsors that helps to make Badlands possible.
I'm excited to announce that we're having our biggest 3-in-1 sale ever with a limited edition product, a back in stock special, and a closeout deal you won't find anywhere else. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get our MyPillow bed sheets, only $29.88. Any color, any style, any size, even kings, regular $119.98, only $29.88. Once they're gone for good. How about our My Towels? They're finally back in stock, but not for long. Get a 6-piece My Towel set, regular $69.98, now only $39.98. And for the first time and the only time ever, get our limited edition premium My Pillows. They're made with Giza cotton and designer gusset. Queen $17.98, Kings only $19.98. So go to mypillow.com or call the number on your screen. Use your promo code to get the best offers ever. Quantities are extremely limited, so order now.
I traveled recently and took my pillow with me and then forgot it. And I've been not sleeping as well since, so I need to go ahead and get another one pretty soon. All right, let's get into it. By way of a recap, in the last episode, we briefly discussed social contract theory, which is what we are told is the elemental theory behind the form of government that we have. And we talked about how social contract theory has acted like a controlled opposition dynamic. It has funneled our political discontent into an outlet, like a pressure relief valve, as you will, that lets us complain, but doesn't really ever allow us to fully leave the reservation and get at the heart of getting rid of tyranny. And then we began to analyze that theory and the so-called contract that was made under its auspices, the U.S. Constitution. And we did so in light of the 5 key elements that Spooner argues are the non-negotiable, self-apparent principles of natural law contracts. And as a reminder, here they are. A contract must be voluntary. It must be, the consent must be explicit. The contract must be honest. Contract based on fraud is not a valid contract if the fraud is discovered. It must be just. That is to say, 2 criminals can engage in, can write a contract to agree to split their spoils 50-50, but because they were engaging in criminal activity, that's not valid. And then lastly, it must be individually consented to, universally by everyone who is going to be bound by that contract. So in the first of the 19 sections from Spooner's essay, No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, which you can find a link to the PDF of that in the show description, if you want to read the whole thing. As I mentioned last time, it takes, if you're going to read it thoroughly, it would take you about 2 hours or so. But after only that first section, we demonstrated then that the Constitution fails as a natural law binding contract on the fifth point of being universally individual. Not everyone was given an opportunity to have a say at the original ratification, and then subsequent generations have not been given an opportunity to ratify it as they come of age. And again, I believe this is an important topic to talk about. I believe that natural law is important to talk about because going into the golden age, we have this opportunity to reshape our future. I believe we are at a pivotal point in at least American history, if not human history. So if our goal is to end the deep state, whatever that is, and we want to get rid of the tyranny that it has wielded over us for our entire lives and for many, many generations, then we need to have a solid first principles foundation. And men like Spooner help to provide, I use the analogy of like guardrails, or think of like bowling gutter buddies, that we want to get down to the end and knock down the pins, but we need to have a framework for helping us to determine what is and what isn't just. Spooner calls natural law the science of justice. And if you want, head over to the Badlands Substack. Burning Bright was gracious to publish an article I wrote on that, published last Sunday, and kind of an introduction into Spooner's ideas about natural law. And there's a lot more that could be said about it that I said in the article, but at least introduces that concept and presents reasons for why we need to make it part of our conversation today. Okay. I want to say that with the essay containing 19 sections, you might be a little concerned at the pace that we're going here, that the next 18 weeks of your life are going to be wrapped up in just this one essay. But a number of the middle sections are essentially the same topic. Spooner just attacks it from multiple angles, demonstrating his impeccable thoroughness and exploring every logical iteration of different objections or ideas. So once we get to those sections, I'm planning on condensing them down into just 1 week, so we should be able to get through it more quickly. Wanted to say thank you so much for the warm reception of the first episode. It was a lot of fun hanging out with you guys in the chat, and it's been a whirlwind here over the last month, even just having the idea, and then all of a sudden now here I am hosting a show on Badlands. Pretty awesome. So thanks so much for the reception. Thank you for the rants last week. I was able to grab those. We got Polymathanon for $20. First rant, love you, brother. Love you right back. No homo. Although we don't have to say that, I guess. Beth dropped $100. Second rant, excited for you, Jonathan. Godspeed and blessings. No Romo, but I really appreciate all the knowledge you bring me and others. Lots of love. And she coined that phrase, no Romo, because as a girl, no homo doesn't really fit. So no Romo for no romance. Tattooed Teacher for $10. Excellent premiere. Excited for this new Badlands show. Best wishes from the Badlandia Task Force. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to meet you there at Deadwood back in August. KK54, $10. Great podcast. Thank you. And then David H. Paul, $1, but for a $100 idea. I would love to see Chris and BB engage with you on these types of topics. Great material. Well, Chris does engage with these types of topics quite frequently over on his Telegram channel, t.me/very reasonable, I believe. His chat is always hopping, and Spooner comes up frequently, usually my fault. But Chris enjoys to, from what I observe, he enjoys engaging with this topic. So thank you again for the support. If you'd like to continue to support the show, obviously, as we all are aware, the thumbs up helps with the algorithm on Rumble. And if you'd like to support the show individually, I've been set up with Badlands Boost. So if you go to badlandsmedia.tv/boost and then click the drop-down menu, you can specifically designate this show. You can drop a question there or comment. I'd be happy to read it here on the show. And then also I decided to go ahead and set up a Telegram channel, t.me/the No Treason Podcast. There's a chat set up with it as well. So if you want to drop a question over there, get points of clarification, or bring your own insight to the conversation, I'd be happy to check that out. I mentioned meeting tattoo teacher at GART. Let me pull this up here. There we are. Still getting used to the controls. So yeah, the next GART is coming up just a few weeks from now in Cocoa Beach, Florida, November 6th through 9th. As I mentioned last time, I really enjoyed the two that I've been to. I went to Myrtle Beach and Deadwood. GART is the best people all coming together for a whole weekend to talk and hang out, unfettered by normie insecurities. And the saying would be cliche, but I'll say it anyway. It really is like a big family. People you've never met before, but it feels like you're long lost friends. And I experienced that firsthand. The logistics of getting from Rapid City Airport to Deadwood are kind of a pain, but Peggy P for Patriot in the Deadwood chat had offered to give people rides. So I was able to get with her and her husband and make the hour drive from the airport. We were joined by Danny A, also active in the Deadwood chat. She's the coordinator for the Illinois Badlanders meetup. And, it's an hour drive, went by really fast. It was like old friends picking up where we left off. And then it was funny because it turns out that Danny and my wife have been friends for a number of years. And so that was, a case of small world. We took a selfie and sent it to my wife, and her reaction was quite fun as she said, like, it was like her worlds colliding. So head over to badlandsmedia.tv/events to get your tickets. If you can't make it in person, I highly recommend you get the virtual tickets. That gives you access to the special live streams. Was one this past Thursday, leading up as the Badlands host, the panel speakers banter ideas back and forth, usually have some lively arguments. It also gives you access to the Telegram chat. And as Burning Bright said recently, the GART Telegram chat is kind of like the hardcore Badlanders hangout before, during, and after a GART. The Deadwood one is still going on. And I would say, in spite of John's poo-pooing the pet pictures, most of us are glad that Rob started Furry Friday, because honestly, who says the InfoWar can't be cute and cuddly? Everyone seems to enjoy the Friday pet pictures. So until the 15th, tickets for virtual tickets are on sale. They're down from $35 to $30. So you have a few days to capitalize on that. Okay, before we get into section 2, I wanted to address a couple of comments that Spotzel, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, made in the live chat last week. Paraphrasing his first one, he said that current contract law allows for parents and grandparents to place legal restrictions on future generations through wills or trusts or something like that. And then the second comment was, wouldn't all laws go against natural law? If yes, and you follow that reasoning to its end, the result is lawlessness, maybe. So for the first comment, I understand that's a thing. Personal anecdote, my father-in-law inherited some farmland from his grandparents within the last couple of years. And there were, it was put in a trust or something like that. So there were stipulations on how that land was to be divided up between him and his siblings. But the short answer for that would be that rather than reason from the standpoint of any current legal structure, which I would argue, like most legislation, is just like a false layer that's been put on top of natural law, we should instead, as Spooner argues, we should start with natural law and ask the simple question, does the current legal structure comply with and respect natural law? There's lots of nuances to that question, and that's something that Spooner gets into in depth in his essay, Trial by Jury, He calls it an essay, but it's over 200 pages, so it's more like a book. I'm thinking that after No Treason, that will be the next thing we'll go to, because that's really where the rubber meets the road of how Spooner envisions a society functioning on a legal standpoint. So I'm going to save a longer answer until then, but that's the short answer. And then for the second comment, which is similar in thought, the argument against the logical end of natural law being not lawlessness is that if you are arguing from natural law and therefore restricting legislation to the narrow boundaries that it requires, then the logical end is not lawlessness, but is human liberty. I would argue that what we have today is codified lawlessness. The thing that you are concerned about has already happened. It just looks more polished because it has a structured system around it. We talk about a multi-tier system of justice. We talk about rules for them, not for us. The famous George Carlin elite club and you're not in it comment applies here. We're essentially at the mercy of the whims of whoever controls the levers of power. And that's the political game that we're subjected to, is trying to get our hands on that power and using it against our enemies and vice versa. And I would argue that that is more barbaric than otherwise. So I'll reserve more comments on that again until we get to the trial by jury, which I'm hoping to get to, like as I mentioned, after we get through No Treason. All right, let's take another quick break and hear from the awesome people over at Rise Attire.
What is the Sovereign Alliance? The Sovereign Alliance are a collection of leaders and countries that are aligned not in the vision for their countries, but against a vision that has been thrust upon them. I believe that the Sovereign Alliance is less a battle for something and more a battle against something. They are against globalism, collectivism. They are against the rules-based international order.
Sovereign Alliance, the latest addition to Badlands Rise merch, available now at badlandsmedia.tv/rise.
That's such a cool ad. I first became aware of Rise Attire. They've been in the Patriot game for a long time. Back in the height of the Q Drop era, I was listening a lot to In Pursuit of Truth, iPod over on YouTube, and Sir Patrick Mack worked with them to produce some merchandise. So that was the first time I remember being aware of their of what they do there. Okay, so today we are going to discuss probably the most euphemistic aspect of the social contract in action. Section 2 of the No Treason essay wonders, does voting constitute as providing legal notification of voluntary consent and explicit consent, and thereby provide the Constitution with the backing it needs in order to be a valid and binding contract? Now, this may seem like an odd thing to even attempt doing, because it seems rather obvious that, of course, voting provides consent. But to quote the cameraman Larry from the movie Groundhog Day, played by Chris Elliott, there's a heck of a lot more to it than just that. Let me pull up my slides here. Section 2 begins, all the voting that has ever taken place under the Constitution has been of such a kind that it not only did not pledge the whole people to support the Constitution, but it did not even pledge any one of them to do so, as the following considerations show. And then what follows are these 10 considerations. Number 1, voting only binds those who vote. Number 2, voting only binds for the duration of the term. Number 3, voting must be voluntary. Number 4, the threat of taxation makes voting potentially not voluntary. Number 5, votes for unsuccessful candidates in an election are not de facto votes to sustain the Constitution as a whole. Number 6, votes may well be considered votes against the Constitution, depending on the context. Number 7, a secret ballot system removes voting as a legal form of proof for support. Number 8, a secret ballot system opens the door for conjecture as to the motives behind a person's vote. Number 9, a secret ballot system removes personal responsibility of the individual voter. And number 10, a secret ballot system creates a secret government. Starting with point 1, voting only binds those who vote. Spooner writes, in the very nature of things, the act of voting could bind nobody but the actual voters. But owing to the property qualifications required, it is probable that during the first 20 or 30 years under the Constitution, not more than 1/10, 15th, or perhaps 20th of the whole population, black and white, men, women, and minors, were permitted to vote. Consequently, so far as voting was concerned, not more than 1/10, 15th, or 20th of those then existing could have incurred any obligation to support the Constitution. And consider that was the similar observation he made in Section 1, that not more than 1/10, 15th, or 20th, as I just read, could have incurred any obligation to support the Constitution. We know some people did vote, but not all who could vote did vote, and not all who voted or who could vote who voted in favor. We talked about how the Articles of Confederation were essentially violated by the ratification of the Constitution. And so, as such, the Constitution would really only apply to those who voted in favor, which would make it a non-legally binding contract. Moving on to point 2, voting only binds for the duration of the term. No one, by voting, can be said to pledge himself for any longer period than that for which he votes. If, for example, I vote for an officer who is to hold his office for only a year, I cannot be said to have thereby pledged myself to support the government beyond that term. Therefore, on the ground of actual voting, it probably cannot be said that more than 1/9 or 1/8 of the whole population are usually under any pledge to support the Constitution. And Spooner supports his last claim with something that we would all be familiar with, that many people only vote once in 2, 3, 5, or 10 years in periods of great excitement. I mentioned getting a degree in political science, and I remember during that time, a lot of attention in the classes were paid to learning how to statistically analyze voter turnout, because as the clergy of the religion of statism, it's important to recognize the up and down trends over time and be able to provide candidates with these stupid buzzwords and slogans that they use to try to drum up that sort of periods of great excitement. And it's the job of the political scientist to figure those out for them. That was one of the things that disillusioned me. The whole thing was learning how to manipulate numbers to get the results that you want. So going back to Spooner's idea, because the vote is for a specific office with a specific term, the person who does the voting can't be said to have voted for anything beyond that. And this would make sense for us, because if you imagine this in a context today, let's say you signed up for a subscription service that had a term of 1 year, and after that year, you decided that you didn't really like the service and you wanted to cancel it. But then the provider insists that you had actually signed up for life, and you'd also signed over your children to continue the subscription. And if you resisted, they're going to send armed guards to your home and force payment. That's absurd, obviously. And yet that's exactly what we have going on in the case of the Constitution. It talks about itself being a contract. People talk about it being a contract, and yet it's not really a contract, because you don't really have a choice, and a contract must be voluntary. Which brings us to point 3. Voting must be voluntary. It cannot be said that by voting, a man pledges himself to support the Constitution unless the act of voting be a perfectly voluntary one on his part. let's see here. Oh, and then he goes on to say, yet the act of voting cannot properly be called a voluntary one on the part of any very large number of those who do vote. It is rather a measure of necessity imposed upon them by others than one of their own choice. And Spooner goes ahead and fleshes that out by quoting from some of his earlier writing. And I'm going to go ahead and read this entire section here. I won't have it up on the screen, but he sets up some powerful analogies. He writes, in truth, in the case of individuals, their actual voting is not to be taken as proof of consent, even for the time being. On the contrary, it is to be considered that without his consent having even been asked, a man finds himself environed by a government that he cannot resist, a government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forego the exercise of many of his natural rights under peril of weighty punishments. He sees, too, that other men practice this tyranny over him by use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will but use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from this tyranny of others by subjecting them to his own. In short, he finds himself, without his consent, so situated that if he use the ballot, he may become a master. If he does not use it, he must become a slave. And he has no other alternative than these two. In self-defense, he attempts the former. His case is analogous to that of a man who has been forced into battle, where he must either kill others or be killed himself. Because to save his own life in battle, a man attempts to take the lives of his opponents. It is not to be inferred that the battle is one of his own choosing, neither in contests with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for a bullet, because as his only chance of self-preservation, a man uses a ballot. Is it to be inferred that the contest is one into which he voluntarily entered? That he voluntarily set up all his own natural rights as a stake against those of others, to be lost or won by the mere power of numbers? On the contrary, it is to be considered that in an exigency into which he had been forced by others, and in which no other means of self-defense offered, he, as a matter of necessity, used the one that was left to him. Doubtless, the most miserable of men, under the most oppressive government in the world, if allowed the ballot, would use it, if they could see any chance of thereby ameliorating their condition. But it would not, therefore, be a legitimate inference that the government itself that crushes them was one which they had voluntarily set up or ever consented to. Therefore, a man's voting under the Constitution of the United States is not to be taken as evidence that he ever freely assented to the Constitution, even for the time being. And then Spooner concludes that because we have no proof of anyone's consent via the ballot, and in fact it is therefore impossible under the above considerations to faithfully ascertain the voluntary consent of any one voter, we are therefore able to nullify the entire operation. Moving on. He says, because of this difficulty that we cannot have any legal assurance of consent, he argues that as we can have no legal knowledge as to who votes from choice and who are from the necessity thus forced upon him, we can have no legal knowledge as to any particular individual that he voted from choice, or consequently that by voting he consented or pledged himself to support the government. On general principles of law and reason, it cannot be said that the government has any voluntary supporters at all until it can be distinctly shown who its voluntary supporters are. And this phrase, on general principles of law and reason, is going to be something we'll be very familiar with because he uses it quite a lot. So voting must be voluntary. And then point 4, the threat of taxation makes voting potentially not voluntary. As taxation is made compulsory on all, whether they vote or not, a large proportion of those who vote no doubt do so to prevent their own money being used against themselves, when in fact they would have gladly abstained from voting if they could thereby have saved themselves from taxation alone, to say nothing of being saved from all the other usurpations and tyrannies of the government. So to the common retort that I alluded to last week, that paying taxes counts as giving consent, Spooner would say to take a man's property without his consent and then to infer his consent because he attempts by voting to prevent that property from being used to his injury is a very insufficient proof of his consent to support the Constitution. It is, in fact, no proof at all. So the phrase that we're all familiar with, your money or your life, you could rephrase that to say your money or your vote. Moving on. Point 5. Votes for unsuccessful candidates in an election are not de facto votes to sustain the Constitution as a whole. Those who vote for the unsuccessful candidates cannot properly be said to have voted to sustain the Constitution. They may, with more reason, be supposed to have voted not to support the Constitution, but specifically to prevent the tyranny which they anticipate the successful candidate intends to practice upon them under color of the Constitution, and therefore may reasonably be supposed to have voted against the Constitution itself. And I would say this is a more reasonable supposition. The voting is only allowed, it's the only mode allowed to us to express our dissent for the Constitution. The American Civil War demonstrated that rather explicitly, and again was one of the reasons that Spooner became more radicalized in his thinking. Think about how many times people say that they didn't vote for a candidate, but they voted against a candidate. I know the only presidential election that I participated in was the first one I was eligible to vote in, was the Bush-Kerry. I was almost 21. My older brother was kind of giving me crap for voting for Bush, but I remember telling him that, well, I don't really like Bush, but I really don't want John Kerry to get in. So that's really why I voted for Bush. That's garbage thinking, but we all end up doing it at some point. How many votes in 2016 were more against Hillary than for Donald Trump? I know Burning Bright has made the observation that many people voted for Donald Trump by accident, and they did so likely voting against Hillary Clinton. Moving on, point 6. Votes may well be considered votes against the Constitution depending on the context. Many votes are usually given for candidates who have no prospect of success. Those who give such votes may reasonably be supposed to have voted as they did, with a special intention not to support, but to obstruct the execution of the Constitution, and therefore against the Constitution itself. This makes me think of the third-party candidate narrative that we are hit with every now and again. In my lifetime, I believe Ross Perot would probably be the most notable of those. And it's also a common argument, as I mentioned before, that, it's similar to what I mentioned before of voting against a candidate instead of voting for one. We are told that not voting is actually a vote for the bad guy. And I would say that's an absurd argument because, first of all, it's not possible to determine legally anyone's motivation for voting. And so in a bifurcated election system, there's no way to verify someone's reasons for not voting in the same way as being able to determine the reasons for voting. And one of the other things that makes that an absurd argument is both sides use that same argument. They try to kowtow. There was a discussion recently on how to pronounce that or how to spell it, to force people into voting by saying, well, if you're not voting, you're actually helping the bad guy to win. But because that goes for both sides, it's a null argument, in my opinion. I would say that the reality is that not voting is ultimately the most moral choice, but we'll get into that later. Point 7. A secret ballot disqualifies voting as legal form or legal support, legal proof for support. As all the different votes are given secretly by secret ballot, there is no legal means of knowing from the votes themselves who votes for and who votes against the Constitution. Therefore, voting affords no legal evidence that any particular individual supports the Constitution. And where there can be no legal evidence that any particular individual supports the Constitution, it cannot be legally said that anybody supports it. In light of this and the previous considerations, legal proof then of the intentions of large numbers of men is basically impossible which implies there's a scalability problem with an election system. And the issue of a secret ballot, you will learn as we move on, is something that's extremely important to Spooner. He continues with that thread in point 8, that a secret ballot system opens the door for conjecture as to the motives behind a person's vote. There being no legal proof of any man's intentions in voting, we can only conjecture them. And thinking of back to the 5 points of a legal contract, that consent must be explicit, this speaks directly to that. So we can only conjecture them. Maybe some people were honest in their vote. Maybe some people were afraid of the powers of government being used to tyrannize them. So really they would have abstained if they could, but they felt like they couldn't. Maybe some wanted to use the powers of government to be the tyrant themselves, in which case they would be unjust and therefore make that contract null and void. Spooner adds, as a conjecture, it is probable that a very large proportion of those who vote do so on this principle. That is, that if by voting they could but get the government into their own hands or that of their friends and use its powers against their opponents, then they would willingly support the Constitution. That's a hot topic today with the weaponization of the justice system and all of that sort of thing. And again, returning to the 5 elements of a legal contract under natural law, this speaks to the concept of explicit consent. And then also to the point of being just and not engaging in criminal activity. Moving on to point 9, to continue the secret ballot thread, a secret ballot system removes personal responsibility of the individual voter. Spooner writes, no man can reasonably or legally be said to do such a thing as to assent to or support the Constitution unless he does it openly and in a way to make himself personally responsible for the acts of his agents, so long as they act within the limits of the power he delegates to them. This point of personal responsibility, Spooner goes into in greater depth in a little while, because this really is an important aspect. I'll hold off comments on that until we get there. But the short answer is that on general principles of law and reason, to coin Spooner's phrase, the commissioner of an agent is, of course, responsible for the actions of their agent. Think of a general contractor like a tree service, and if the tree falls on your car, they're responsible for the damage. So Spooner is going to expound on that line of thinking later on, and we'll get into that. Moving on to the last point, point 10. A secret ballot system creates a secret government. As all voting is secret by secret ballot, and as all secret governments are necessarily only a secret band of robbers, tyrants, and murderers, the general fact that our government is practically carried on by means of such voting only proves that there is among us a secret band of robbers, tyrants, and murderers whose purpose is to rob, enslave, and so far as necessary to accomplish their purposes, murder the rest of the people. This simple fact of the existence of such a band does nothing towards proving that the people of the United States, in quotes, or any one of them voluntarily supports the Constitution. And this concept of the secret band of robbers and murderers is something that Spooner refers to quite a lot, so we'll definitely get that fleshed out. And he argues that this really is the true nature of a social contract government. And really, you could argue, in thinking back to the controlled opposition aspect of social contract theory, that in the evolution of the global regime's method of subjecting people, that social contract theory was devised as a cover for this secret band of robbers and tyrants. Okay. In conclusion, so far, therefore, as voting is concerned, the Constitution, legally speaking, has no supporters at all. So we think again about the nature of a legal contract and the 5 requirements. I'll pull them back up here again. Legal contract must be voluntary, but we can see how some people may well vote involuntarily. Contracts must be explicit in consent, but we can see that due to a secret ballot, we are reduced to guessing what someone's motives may be in supporting it. Contracts must be honest, but we can see how some people's motives in voting secretly conceal their true intentions for how they want to use government power. Contracts must be just, but we can see that some people's motives in voting may well be to wield that power unjustly. And then lastly, contracts must be universally individual, but we can see that not everyone ostensibly bound by the contract was able to consent to it. And the way that voting is done in this country, and really it might be said of any system of voting, I'm not sure it is possible to have a natural law congruent election system, at least on scale. We can see that the way we do it violates all 5 of these self-apparent aspects of natural law contracts. Hopefully, after all that objection I referred to earlier, that of course voting provides consent, you can see that that objection seems less reasonable. And to repeat the quote from Larry the cameraman, there's a heck of a lot more to it than just that. So now we've seen that from sections 1 and 2, the Constitution, by virtue of its claims as a contract, cannot be anything of the sort. And Spooner's opening claim in section 1 that the Constitution has no inherent authority or obligation should be less shocking, or at least less unreasonable. And of course, we still have supporters of it, hopefully less as we go on. And Spooner would then have the following to say by dividing supporters of the Constitution into 3 classifications. 1, knaves, a numerous and active class who see in their government an instrument which they can use for their own aggrandizement or wealth. 2, dupes, a large class, no doubt, each of whom, because he is allowed one voice out of millions in deciding what he may do with his own person and his own property, and because he is permitted to have the same voice in robbing, enslaving, and murdering others that others have in robbing, enslaving, and murdering himself, is stupid enough to imagine that he is a free man, a sovereign, that this is a free government, a government of equal rights, the best government on earth, and such like absurdities. And then the last class, 3, a class who have some appreciation of the evils of government, but either do not see how to get rid of them, or do not choose to do so, far sacrifice their personal or their private interests as to give themselves seriously and earnestly to the work of making a change. Now, I want to take a moment and say that some of you out there might feel a little bit raw from having the foundation of your American identity challenged, and that these new ideas might have chapped your hide a little, maybe roughened you up. It turns out that Badlands Media has something that might be able to help with that.
They say confidence starts with smooth skin. And baby, Soft Disclosure Lotion delivers.
I swear by this stuff. Like, I kid you guys not. This is the first lotion I've ever had in my entire life that, like, I don't get ashy after I put it on any part of my body. Like, my hands are always dry, and my hands have not gotten ashy without, like, rinsing them through water and washing them with soap since I started putting Soft Disclosure on. Like, it is black man approved. I kid you not.
Black man approved. You heard him. And let's be real. If it can handle his hands, it can handle anything.
Feet are like, they get so dry, like the heels of them, it'll just kind of like flake off. Like, but with Soft Disclosure, once you put it on, like it starts to absorb it.
Yeah, he went there. Don't worry, we won't show you his feet, but trust us, they're smoother too. Soft Disclosure Lotion is made with aloe, goat's milk, honey, and our exclusive oil blend that actually restores your skin barrier. Visit softdisclosure.com, use code BADLANDS, and get 15% off.
So looking ahead to next week, we'll cover section 3. Should be less controversial. The question is, does the paying of taxes count as providing consent? That one's a little easier to work through. Spooner breaks it down, and as he does with voting, into a number of different points. And I think you'll find, though, that there are some I remember when I first read this, it was stuff that I had never even thought of. Spooner's pretty good about that, about fishing out elements of arguments that just would never occur to you otherwise. He was, I would say, quite a brilliant man. So obviously this episode went on a little longer than I was hoping for, but there was a lot of material to cover. But I appreciate you all for joining me, for putting up with this controversial stuff. And hopefully we can take this stuff, and as we think on it and use it moving forward into the golden age, we really can get ourselves away from the tyranny that we are all very tired of. I know for one I am. I want my children to be able to grow up in a world where they're not essentially slaves. I'll see you all next week, next Sunday. Again, you feel free to drop a boost or a rant. Come over to t.me/the No Treason Podcast on Telegram and join the conversation over there. But for now, appreciate it. See you next week.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.